Ahora sí vamos a la segunda presentación entonces.
Hello everybody, and thanks to INIA for inviting me to give a presentation today on my experience in fine wool production in Australia. I've been a farmer for only a few years. My mum married my stepdad, who's been a farmer his whole life, when I was around 16 years old. At the time I stayed in town, finished school, and then I went to university and became a lawyer. I worked for the Tasmanian government for a number of years and then resigned after I had my first child. During this time, my partner and I thought that we might like to farm, so we purchased a farm in partnership with my parents. In 2021, I was awarded a Nuffield Scholarship. Nuffield Scholarships are industry awards that are given to individuals who apply who want to make a difference in the world of agriculture. So my scholarship was awarded to me by Australian Wool Innovation, and my topic is around carbon neutral wool production. So this scholarship is a travel scholarship and requires me to travel outside of Australia. So far I've been to Ireland, the United Kingdom, the United States, Costa Rica, Argentina, Uruguay and Chile. I've got to present my report in September 2023. So when I was at university, I really loved international law, regulations. I'm a nature lover, so my scholarship topic was really born out of the unintended consequences that can occur on farm when there's big climate goals that are made. And then I'll talk about how that came about a little bit later on in my presentation. So at the moment, my research has really morphed into looking at that more broader environmental stewardship on the farm and not just focusing on carbon. And I'll discuss, ways in which we're looking at that in Australia. I've also just been awarded a 2022 Climate Smart Farming Scholarship. And the idea of these scholarships is to create like a group of alumni that are innovative and free-thinking farmers that want to have a positive impact on rural and regional Australia. And that scholarship involves training with a number of educational institutions, including the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University. So that's quite an exciting thing that's happening at the moment. So today I'm just going to go over our farming operation. I'm going to cover like our genetic selection, our wool production, lambing, the pain relief options that we have, and our native vegetation restoration. I'll then talk about greenhouse gas accounting and sort of the complexities around that and what it means on our farm. And then I'll explain a project that we've been part of, which is around natural capital accounting. And then I'll look at some of the policies and goals that are going to be coming or have become in Australia that are going to influence farming into the future. So our farm is on a little island off the southern edge of Australia. It's called Tasmania, and it's at about 42 degrees south. Being an island, we have quite a varied climate. So there are parts of Tasmania that have really high levels of rainfall. Where we farm, we only get about 600 millimetres per year, so quite low. Being an island, we have quite a few advantages. A big one of those is that we don't actually have any predators for our sheep. So things like foxes and wild dogs aren't in Tasmania. Now, Tasmania itself, so our farm is in an area called the Midlands of Tasmania, and the farm is called Lewisham. And then we have the two other properties, so the farm that I own, which is down the road, and then we also have another 1,000 hectares, which we bought purely for conservation purposes, and I'll explain why we did that later in the talk. So we have about 180 hectares of irrigated pastures. So on my farm, it's 100 hectares and 76 hectares is under irrigation. And then on Lewisham, we have the other sort of 100 hectares of irrigable pastures. So we have a self-replacing merino flock on our property. We join about 3,500 ewes every year. Now, the principles that we run our farm under are things really based around looking after the land. So It's about looking after the land and also looking after our animals. So we really strongly believe that if you keep your animals healthy, then they make you money. And we also believe that we're just custodians of the land, and it's our responsibility to leave it in a better condition than what we found it for future generations. So we use minimal inputs, especially under our irrigation, and we have mostly permanent perennial pastures. We use rotational or cell grazing principles. So on Lewisham, we have 160 paddocks, and that's really to maintain ground cover and the benefits that that brings in terms of pasture growth and soil health. So about a decade ago, my parents decided that they would like to breed a merino that produced both wool and meat. And that was really around diversifying their income stream to create a more resilient business. So they've been very successful in this, and we've been genetically selecting for meat traits, looking at early growth and eye muscle and fat for the last 10 years. And the reality of the wool industry in Australia is that a lot of people are heading down this track. So they're chasing those meat characteristics, often to the detriment of their wool clip. And that's really just driven purely by market and finance. So historically, sort of maybe like 20 years ago, the income from the farm would have been made up of around 70% wool and around 30% meat. And now our income would be sort of 35% wool and 65% meat. And there really seems to be this continued transition. And I guess the reality is that if you want to make productivity gains, it's much easier to do it with increasing meat output and number of lambs than it is to try and grow more wool. I guess the other impact that has seen this transition is really around changing markets and changing climates. So the more fertile and faster growing animals that you have, it does fit in better with the climate change that we're seeing in Australia, as you're able to sort of fluctuate your flock better and be more flexible with the more extreme seasons. So just as an indicator of what our sheep are looking like, having chased those meat characteristics, so recently we weighed our 1-year-old ewes, and the average for the light ewes was 54 kilos, and the average weight for the heavy ones was 61 kilos. So with the bloodlines that we've been using is from a stud called Keren Pole, which is from mainland Australia. We've also had a really few hard years with intestinal worms, and that is caused in part by the La INIA that we've had. So for what that means for us is high rainfall, and that really just means that we're sort of, constantly having that intestinal worm problem. So given that, we've also started introducing into our genetics some of the Anderson blood, which I know some of you are familiar with. I got the pleasure of seeing some of those rams when I was in Uruguay earlier this year. So we're using those. Some of it's coming direct through the Anderson stud, and then others is coming through the Keren Pole stud, because they're also using those Anderson genetics, looking at fecal egg count. So we obviously also look at our wool figures when we're doing genetics and, the wool style and condition, but, the wool has been less of a focus for the last 10 years compared to the meat focus. This year we've implemented genomics testing. So that photo there is, you can see that we're collecting some of the genomics data, and that's really so we can produce the Australian standard breeding values and seeing where the flock's going, and hopefully get that genetic improvement faster from that information that we can get. So in terms of our wool production, so our wool is between 17.2 and 20.1 micron. We have that self-replacing merino flock, so we don't buy sheep in. We do buy a few rams every year. But other than that, we sort of breed our own flock rams as well. We do around 30,000 kilos of greasy wool per year. We don't run a wether flock, so we only run ewes. So all of our wethers will go for meat as lamb in their first year of their life. Sometimes they will be shorn before they go, but a lot of them won't be. And that's partly because it's expensive to get the wool off them, and it's not worth shearing them for the cost of it. Some of them, in some instances, we may. So some of that can sort of depend on what's going on with the market. In terms of our wool production, so for a long time we were going for that length. So that means now that we do a shearing every 8 to 9 months, and that's because it's a better length. This year we were going to try and move to a 5 and 7 month shearing with the aim of being a 6 and 6. Unfortunately, just the way that the labour market is in Australia for shearers, it just really hasn't worked out. The cost of shearing has become very expensive as well. So the idea of doing like a 5 month shearing and getting just not enough wool off, it means that we probably won't be able to make the cost up compared with the sale of that wool. So we're probably going to stick with that 8 to 9 month shearing again. And we might revisit that in a few years depending on how we go with our genetic selection through the flock. In terms of lambing, so lambing's obviously a big thing in terms of productivity. So across our mob, we get around 130% survival. So that's from pregnancy scanning through to marking. So we pregnancy scan all of our ewes and we take out the dries, the singles, the twins and the triplets. And then each of those mobs is treated differently. So different levels of food requirement and that kind of thing. And they all also get lambed in really small mobs. So there would be a few mobs that would have around 100 sheep, but most of them would be less than that. And the idea is that you can give them privacy. They can, not competing for, shelter in terms of lambing spots, and also they're not kind of competing with their babies. So that seems to be quite successful for us. We also lamb our ewes in sheltered paddocks. So in some areas of the farm we have quite nice silvo pastures, so trees through the pastures, and then there's different sort of areas with shrubs, and we've done shelter belts as well so that we have those sheltered areas for lambing. So pain relief at marking time. So in Australia we have quite a few different pain relief options. On our farm, there's 2 that we use. So the 2 that we use is Numbnuts, which is the brand name of the drug is Numbnuts. So Numbnuts is the applicator. And then we use a drug called Meloxicam, which is also known as Metacam. So Numbnuts is like a targeted pain relief for tail docking and castration of sheep. So you have to use it with a rubber ring. And what happens is the applicator puts the rubber ring on and administers the pain relief at the same time. Now, the drug Numbnuts is also known as lignocaine, and it's the same drug that the dentist would give you when you go in to have a filling. So it's very fast acting and it does wear off after a couple of hours. So the idea is that we give that to the lamb. So if you're a wether, you will get that when your tail's being docked, and then you would get that at castration as well. Given that it only lasts for a few hours, we also give Meloxicam injection now. So it's Meloxicam 20 milligram. And that is a long-acting pain relief and it lasts for 3 days. So the Meloxicam takes, an hour or 2 to kick in. So you've got that initial pain relief from the Numbnuts, and then the Meloxicam kicks in as the Numbnuts wears off. So you're getting that 3 days of pain relief. A couple of years ago, we couldn't get Meloxicam 20 injectable, so we were using a different, which was Meloxicam 10, and that drug was called buckalgesic. And what it is instead of an injection, it was like a drench, so you put it in the cheek of the animal. It's only 24 hours of pain relief. It's quite difficult to administer, so it's quite a thick viscous gel. So we found it quite a pain to use. So when the injectable Meloxicam came out, we found it better, A, because it's easier to give an animal an injection, and B, because it lasted for the 3 days. In terms of cost, it costs about, across the flock, $2.20 an animal. So that's averaged out. So obviously your wethers are going to be more than your ewes, but we just take the total cost and average it out over the flock. So native vegetation. So nature, biodiversity and the ecosystem are really important to us on our farm. So the catchment that Lewisham is in is 85% cleared. So we feel that we have a responsibility to try and restore the areas of land to improve the ecosystem services and improve in biodiversity. So given this, we dedicate a lot of time and resources to native vegetation restoration, as well as the conservation of areas that already have natural value. So we want to create habitat where native animals can thrive, and hopefully native plant communities can be self-sufficient in terms of reseeding itself. So I think it's important to think about nature in terms of the fact that nature does so many amazing things for us. It's not just sitting there doing nothing. So when you have a native ecosystem, it's performing all these sorts of functions, whether it's, decomposition, nutrient cycling, pollination, all of those tasks. And when we clear it, we inherit that work. And the only way that we know how to do that work is through, mechanical means or chemical application. So it's really important to protect any native system that you already have, because it's really hard to recreate it. But also we need to value what those native systems bring to us. So on our farm, we plant sort of maybe about 10 to 15,000 plants per year. My mum is a botanist and she loves growing plants. So she actually grows all of the plants on farm. So we grow around 55 species. We do a lot of our own seed collection so we can ensure provenance to the catchment. And then the seeds are propagated in the nursery. You can see the pictures here. So the idea with the plant selection is that they must be native to the local area. We're looking for diversity in terms of what we plant. When we consider what species to use, we look at a number of attributes. So we want plants of varying size, varying textures, so from grasses to sedges, ground covers, small prickly shrubs, large shrubs and trees. So we want flowers that are different shapes and different colours and that are going to suit a wide range of pollinators. We want to look for nectar and pollen producing plants that produce these at different times of year. So the idea is that we can have a large insect population on the farm, and then from that you're going to have the building blocks of your ecosystem. So you're going to have a food source for your vertebrates, you're going to have food source for your bats and your birds. So as insects balloon across the landscape, we want to have a habitat that they can land in and build a home. Now, we completed a greenhouse gas audit in 2021. So just to provide a little bit of context around this, Australian agriculture is responsible for approximately 13% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And of that, around 58% is from sheep and cows, which is the enteric methane. So I'm sure most of you are aware, but it is important to note that the methane emitted from a sheep or cow is from its digestive system. It's biogenic methane, meaning that it's methane that's been naturally occurring in the methane cycle for millions of years. And this methane cycle typically cycles in about 12 years. So the methane released today will be gone in about 12 years. And that's in comparison to like a geosphere methane, which is released when you dig up fossil fuels, so a coal mine or a gas mine. But under the greenhouse gas accounting systems, both of those types of methane are considered the same. So in terms of the accounting frameworks, there is that sort of conflict between those two things, because what's happening on farm is considered the same as digging up a fossil fuel. So in 2021, a company that we contract with our wool to, called Autovox, which is a German outdoor company, asked us to do carbon audits. So they source all their wool from Tasmania, and they wanted to know what the carbon emissions of a woolen t-shirt were. Stephen Wiedemann was engaged to do carbon audits across all the farms. And as you can see from this, the majority of our emissions came from methane, which is that enteric methane. Now, in terms of what that sort of told me, this project was really the catalyst for me applying for my Nuffield Scholarship and really getting involved in this area of work, because from what I could see, there were some really negative unintended consequences that could happen if we only focused on carbon. So if you look at this, the mixed environmental plantings that we do to try and recreate an ecosystem and increase biodiversity are really that mixed environmental planting, but in terms of carbon sequestration, they're really low. Whereas if you look at a blue gum or a pine tree, the carbon sequestration rate is really high. But in the environment that I farm in, if you plant a pine plantation, you're going to end up with a really sterile environment. And then there's also issues in terms of just having a monoculture there. So you're not recreating nature, you're not doing a whole bunch of ecosystem services that are so important. So I think from this, it really just showed the negatives if you only focus on that one aspect, and the importance of focusing on more than that. So after we did our carbon audit, my mum actually went and bought another 1,000 hectares of land, and this was land that was going to be logged. It had been logged in the past and it was a growing forest, so it had been selectively logged, so only the big trees had been taken out of it. It's 1,000 hectares. It's an amazing spot. It has quite a few endangered species. In terms of us knowing that we are now carbon neutral, we know that we are. Unfortunately, it's just too expensive to bother proving it on paper, because we're not going to be able to make that up when we sell our wool. So there's no point in getting it all audited. So I think one of the really important things when we're talking about the environment and biodiversity and agriculture is that we're not looking at nature, but we're really just looking at nature exposed to our method of questioning. And I think it's just always important to think about the fact that there's so many complex systems in a natural ecosystem that we still don't understand. And we're just trying to put a frame around that, and it's usually going to be slightly inadequate, or we're going to miss things. So just when you are talking about these things or trying to come up with policy decisions, just to think about the fact that there are some things that you're going to be missing, and to check that you're not getting some unintended consequences. So as I explained with the problems with the methane sort of greenhouse gas accounting frameworks, there are problems. They've been acknowledged, but it's unlikely that they're going to be changed in terms of the international regulations. So it's important for us to try and, quantify the other benefits that are out there in terms of an ecosystem, and natural capital accounting is one of the things that we can do with that. So it's really about how we take stock of renewable and non-renewable natural resources. So the plants, animals, soil, water, air and minerals that combine to create a benefit to people. And when you do the accounting for that, there's standardised concepts that you can use to fit those into. So there was a project that has been run for the last 3.5 years, and it's called Natural Capital Accounting Farm Scale. And the idea was to do natural capital accounts on farms and then to work out the benefits that different ecosystems were providing. So it was a project that was done in partnership with 11 different organisations. So that included the Australian Government and La Trobe University. They surveyed 50 farms, so there was 20 farms in New South Wales, 16 in Victoria and 14 in Tasmania. And this project has now become under a project called Farming for the Future. It had a $2.5 million budget, and it tried to include all key stakeholders, so farmers, farm advisors, farming system groups, agricultural supply chains, financial institutions, investors, governments, conservation land managers and industry groups. So it's quite a broad project scope. So I've only been given an interim account, so I haven't seen our full account, so I can't tell you all about what the results were. But here you can see a map of the farm Lewisham, so that's our property there, and you can see that the different ecosystem types have been mapped. So all of the dark blue is like our revegetation sites. You can see some are long and skinny, so they're shelter belts that we've put in. And then the idea from that is to work out, whether there's pest issues, predation, pollination services, like what are the ecosystem services that are being provided from those different types of ecosystem. And another objective was to work out for farmers what data was useful at being collected to make these accounts easier to do. So the project for us when we were doing it was they wanted historically 5 years of data. So obviously there's problems with collecting all of that. You've got to go back through all your records, and sometimes you're kind of wondering why something was the way it was. But this way it was looking forward. So what information as it happens on farm is useful for us to record, to put into these accounts to make them easier. And probably the best example that I could give from my interim report was the water use per kilo of greasy wool for us. So for us, it was quite high because it took into account all of our irrigation on the farm. But actually, when you look at our wool production, because it's the wether lambs that go on the irrigable pastures, mostly they don't get shorn. So none of that water should actually be allocated to our wool production. There would be a small amount in. But what we should do is that we need to be recording every year what wool sheep are going on the irrigation and which ones are just going for meat. So from our perspective, that's quite a useful target or a useful piece of information to collect, and it's going to be easier to collect it as we're moving sheep on and off the irrigation rather than thinking back and looking previously at the season. So I guess in terms of future influences on Australian agriculture and on our farm, so there's quite a lot of goals, some of them set by the government, some set by industry. So Meat and Livestock Australia, they have a carbon neutral goal for 2030 for all of red meat production in Australia. There's a lot of research being done at the moment to work out how it's possible for us to produce red meat in a carbon neutral way. There's the Sheep Sustainability Framework, which also supports a carbon neutral 2030 goal. There's, the international agreements and obligations such as the Methane Pledge and also an Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework that's just been released. So this is the Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework. So this was the result of the Australian government providing, I think, $4 million of funding for this to be created, and it was seen as a need in terms of the changing customer expectations locally and overseas, and to meet changing export expectations. So it was only released a couple of months ago, and how it applies to wool production specifically hasn't really been spoken about much, but I'm sure that will come in the future. So in terms of agriculture, environment, carbon, nature, all of those things being brought together, I always think it's quite important to think that really we're only going to conserve the things that we love, and we only love what we understand, and we only understand what we are taught. So in terms of agriculture being part of this global solution to climate change, I think, and for us to have some really good, robust policies that are going to be good for agriculture, good for food and fibre production, but also good for the earth, we really need to understand all of those complex systems and bring them together. And we need to have people valuing the production of food and fibre and understanding that it can work alongside nature. So thank you very much.